Right. Okay. So very welcome to Tim and Gareth, who are going to talk to us about HS2 and explain to us why we need to revise our thinking, I think. So Tim.
Right, well, good evening, everybody. Thanks for coming. I know it's August and we've probably got better things to do at this time of year, but it's good to see at least some of you here tonight to listen to us. And thanks for inviting me as well, because I don't think I've ever been to York Green Party. I've certainly been to York, but never met. I don't think I've met many of you. I may have met Andy, who I think is on the cabinet now in York. I think that I'm right in saying that, and has the transport portfolio. I might have Googled that earlier, but I know you're in administration in York with the Lib Dems. Something that we hope to maybe do here in the near future, but we'd be doing it as the larger party. And at the moment, I am councillor in Solihull. I have been as a Green Party councillor for 6 years, and I did have a previous political life. I won't go into that tonight, but I was a councillor previously for another party for 4 years, and I'm currently the spokesperson for our group for environment and transport. So very much cover issues to do with sustainability and transport policy. So HS2 very much on my radar, and I'm also on the council's committee that is liaising with HS2 on the implementation, because here in Solihull we are the first station outside of London on the new railway. So we're quite a critical place on that new infrastructure. And I suppose my take on this, and I've always been in favour of new build railway, is that our messaging as a party has been quite relentless and very much anti-HS2. And I'm certainly from a perspective of being a councillor here in Solihull, which obviously we're Midlands and Birmingham very much on the doorstep. The line obviously goes up to the north where you are. It ends up in York eventually on the second phase. This line is actually at its heart, what's been achieved by building it is an increase in rail capacity. And so at the moment we've got a very car dependent country in terms of people moving on leisure journeys, and goods being moved around the country as well. So we're at about, I think it's close to 90% of journeys in this country are made by road. We're only on about 9 or 10%. Gareth, I'm sure will correct me on the figures.
Yeah, I'll go through some of the figures. So yeah.
Yeah, in terms of rail transport, it's no more than 10%. So we are a very small slice of that cake at the moment. And one of the things that obviously as a party, as a Green Party, we want to see modal shift. We want to see move away from travelling by very polluting means of transport like road vehicles, lorries, flights, and that's very much in our DNA as Greens. So if we want to achieve that modal shift, we need to do something about it, and we need to increase that rail capacity. And what a high-speed line does is it actually releases a lot of capacity on the what we call classic lines. So around my area, we've got lots of different lines coming into places like Birmingham, going down to London, going up to the north. And at the moment, those lines are really congested. They're sharing space. Trains that are running long distance, so the intercity services, they're sharing space with the local services and also the freight services, and it's really at saturation point. I'm talking obviously pre the current COVID crisis, but this isn't expected to go on indefinitely. And unless we do something like HS2, we're just not going to have the capacity to expand locally to increase our modal shift objectives. So if we keep ourselves trapped in the current situation, we're just going to see more and more people travelling by road, and the government's got a road expansion programme at the moment. And I'll just point out, but from a party perspective, we've not really said an awful lot about that. But just one example, a lot of people talk about HS2 will wipe out a lot of ancient woodland. It is true that the woodland will be lost as part of this project, and none of us are happy about that. But just to give an example, the Oxford-Cambridge Expressway that's been built, road building project, actually impacts on 3 times as many ancient woodlands as HS2. We don't really hear our party spokespeople saying that very much and challenging it. And I just think I know my colleague Rosie, who's standing for the leadership of the party, she's done some analysis on this in terms of our social media messaging, and across quite a number of months, and looking at the party's Twitter account and such like, number of times that we had put something out in opposition to HS2 far outweighed anything we said about road building, for example. And so, coming from a Solihull perspective, I suppose I'm looking just at where does opposing HS2 put us, and how would we achieve what we're trying to do in terms of getting people out of cars and getting goods onto railway if we don't have that capacity. And I know our party manifesto talked about building new capacity into the network, but we haven't actually been able to come up with a plan that is credible alongside what is currently proposed that delivers that capacity. Because unless you have a high-speed line that takes those high-speed services off and transfers them onto a new line entirely, we're not going to have what's called released capacity on the local network. And so that is, I suppose, where I'm coming from, that I think that I appreciate where the party policy is, and party policy is against HS2. But at the same time, our policy states that we're in favour of high-speed rail. And of course, around Europe, there's lots of high-speed lines that are being constructed with Green Party support in various countries in Europe. We seem to be quite an outlier with our messaging here. But I just think that from a local perspective, and as a local councillor, I'm trying to do what I can and do the best for my area. And if we don't have that extra capacity, we're really not going to be able to achieve many wins in terms of modal shift in the Solihull area, in Birmingham, up in the north. I mean, HS2, as I mentioned, it comes up as far as York, all the way up to you. So it's going to be, it will unlock a lot of capacity in your area around Leeds, and give you some great connections to other cities in the north and to the Midlands as well. And just to give you some highlights about what I've been doing locally. So I've challenged HS2, so I get to meet with them quite frequently in my role, and I've been able to hold them to account on things like tree felling and vegetation clearance. And they did some quite naughty stuff last year when they were actually clearing it during bird nesting season, and through the influence that we've got, we challenged them on that, and they're not going to do that again. But believe me, they're not. We certainly hauled them over the coals on that one. And we've got, the line actually passes through one of the wards that we represent, and it's one of the most deprived in the borough. And it actually intersects one of the parks in that ward, a very deprived community. So saving open space and such like is really important to us. So I've been working with the local councillors there and HS2 on mitigation measures, and they are going to deliver on that. So there is benefit from us engaging with the project and not just standing there shouting and opposing it. Because we have, over the years, and certainly more recently, we've been able to get some really good changes out of HS2. I'm not saying it's perfect. It's not the line I would build if I was doing it. But I just think that now that it's been approved, now that it's going ahead, the construction is happening. Down here, it's very, very obvious the construction is happening. And I just think we as a party, we should be putting our effort and our time into getting the best out of it, rather than keep shouting and complaining about the project going ahead. And it's got approval. So I'm just really addressing it from that perspective. And I know Gareth is going to talk to you more about the technical side of it, but I think from a political point of view, when you're on the ground, when you're a local councillor, you're elected really to represent your area and try and get the best for it. So I have taken the position of I'll work hard to try and get the best out of this. It's happening, and I just think we focus on the benefits and unlocking and getting that modal shift, because those are the wins that we all want to see. One final point I'll make is I have heard quite a lot of talk recently about well, because of COVID, people are not going to travel as much and such like. If you actually drill down into the figures and look at car use has gone right back up to where it was before this crisis, if not slightly higher. So we're at about or close to 100%, if not higher, in terms of car use again. And you compare that to rail, where we're only about 20%. And that's because of the government messaging, which has been very much, oh, get in the car if you can, rather than take the train. Obviously, to an extent, they've promoted active travel, but not to the extent many of us would like them to. But if anyone can actually argue the case that the demand will not be there in the future, when we've got that evidence now to say that people are driving, people have gone back into their cars, and the rail industry is looking at a recovery. It will take some time because of confidence, and restrictions are still in place in terms of social distancing. But my question would be, just on a final point, the travel that happens in the future, do we want that to be by road as it is at the moment, or do we want that modal shift to take people onto public transport and active travel? And I think that's where we need to be as a party. So this project, in my view, is something we don't necessarily support because we're not content with the route. Maybe we're not content with the way that some of it's been done, but let's try and positively influence and get the best we can. And the travel of the future, which in a pre-COVID environment, it will go back to levels we've seen before. We want more of that to be by train and less of it by car. And I think this project absolutely can do it. We've also got evidence that says more people travel for leisure purposes than actually business and commuting. So as we move forward, as we come out of this crisis, my view is we want those people travelling by train in much higher numbers than is the case now. So with that, if it's okay with you, I'll hand over to Gareth, and he can give us an engineer's perspective.
Thanks very much, Tim. Gareth, you're muted.
Perfect, thank you. So I've been on mute myself, but I was blocked from doing so. So I don't know, Zoom, is this going to work? Right, oh, you've disabled screen sharing. Is it possible to
enable it?
Slides?
Right, done.
Because they help, marvellous. They help a little bit with, there we go. Is that now? What can everyone see?
Red.
Can everyone sees red? Everyone's angry. No, people are giving me thumbs up, which I presume means the slides are up. Although Zoom's being a bit weird, but that's fine. Okay, I'm going to ignore Zoom. Right, thanks, Tim. That was great. That's good because I get to second. I probably would have been better for me to go first and Tim follow, but this has worked out fine. It means I can add to Tim's bits and pieces that he said, and I can kind of shape what I'm delivering. So this presentation is one that I've delivered to a number of people, including HS2 themselves, who had, up until about 18 months ago, zero idea what their railway was for, and indeed certainly had no idea how to sell it to the general public, which is kind of a large fact in why we're kind of where we are now, to be honest, because no one really had a clue what the railway was for. So I'm hoping that this little presentation will help explain that. Firstly, very quickly, I think there's only Tim and Andy de Gorn will know who I am. Hi, Andy, by the way, I've just spotted your face on there. Let me make sure I'm clicking the right thing. Firstly, who am I? My name is Gareth Dennis. I'm a consulting rail engineer, so I'm a track designer. So I design the alignment of railway track, essentially, is my day job for these two. I also lectured for the National College for High Speed Rail and the University of Birmingham, so kind of that's where my lecturing credentials come in. I write for the Railway Press. You might have seen me pinging up a couple of times on BBC News after the tragic incident last week, so I generally pop up as a talking head on that sort of thing. I involved in professional engineering and sort of supporting professional institutions, but kind of importantly for here, I'm the infrastructure chair for the York Cycle campaign as well. So I live in York, and I get quite heavily involved in York stuff relating to that, although perhaps a little bit less. So Andy and I have crossed paths quite a few times in relation to the York Cycle campaign. But I get involved in general York sort of innovation stuff and some stuff about campaigning about some minor idea to electrify the railways, as if that's a good idea. So that's a very brief, quick context for who I am. So to head off some of the normal criticisms I get on Twitter, I'm not paid by HS2. Yes, I have worked on HS2, but pretty much everyone in the rail industry has worked on HS2 at some point. It's a massive project. And the idea that I stand to benefit from HS2 personally if it goes ahead is nonsense, because if it didn't go ahead, there would be a lot more railway work to patch and mend and try and attempt to mirror mirror what HS2 achieves on the existing railway network. So this is the reason I advocate HS2 is because I believe in my heart as a sustainable, as an environmentalist and as a sustainable transport activist, that it's the right thing to do. So that's the context. I'm going to hammer through this at full speed, but if you want to pause me and rerun at any point, that's absolutely fine. Right, I'm going to whiz through that. It's a nice quote, but there's not the time for it. There's a nice picture of Newcastle East Junction, but we're not going to talk about that. So very briefly, I'm going to remind you all why rail is a good idea, why high speed is a good idea, and then why HS2 is a good idea, and a little bit about the context of the future. This is going to be really quick because of time, but hopefully not so quick that you don't follow. As I say, pause me. So first of all, very briefly, why is rail a good idea? Here's Trevithick's first attempt at a rail locomotive on a track. That was just after, that was 1803, 1804, the first steam train moved on tracks as we'd recognize it. And fairly quickly afterwards, we have the Stockton-Darlington. The reason that railways are good is because they combine very high power with very low friction. It's a very good system, and that's kind of why it's existed now for nearly 200 years as we recognize it. But the thing is that, you can see there's some nice trains. The trains look much shinier and fancier and faster, but actually the track looks pretty much the same as it always has. And the reason for that is to do with the thing called the principal load transfer. And essentially, to summarize this, you have a system that's very carefully engineered to take very high stresses between steel on steel. So the contact patch between a wheel and a rail is about the size of your thumbnail, about the size of a 5p piece. And that means that the stresses are very high because you've designed it well, but because that patch is very small, friction is very low, which means that it's an incredibly energy efficient system, which is why for the same energy that you can haul a kind of 1 ton on roads, the same energy you can haul it for 100 miles on the road, you can haul it for about 300 miles on rail for the same energy. So phenomenally more energy efficient. Yeah, 5p piece and an A4 sheet of paper under a HGV wheel. I think you all got the picture there. Yeah, which that ultimately means that per percent modal share, both road and air release 4 times more GHG emissions than rail. So that's even with our railways still having diesel trains everywhere, 4 times more GHG emissions for road and air. And actually, in terms of energy efficiency, rail is 6 or 8 times more energy efficient. And if you look at the specific carbon per passenger, rail can be even more energy efficient than that, 6 or even 8 times more energy efficient or more emissions efficient. So let's have a look at a broader picture. So the reduction in CO2 emissions from 1990 to 2018. So for energy, these are for the different sectors. For energy, I'm sure you all know this, about 60%. For industrial emissions, about 50%. For business emissions, about 40%. Residential's not so good, between 10 and 20%. Transport is about 3%. So in my entire lifetime, the UK has essentially not reduced greenhouse gas emissions from transport. That's pathetic. So here we go. There's a nice graph. And you can see energy has done a very good job of decarbonising. Industry and residences, all right. Industry has not always been a huge chunk, but it has also reduced. And you can see the big pink line there is transport, and it's just bounced around doing very little. It's been an absolute failure of this country to do anything about emissions from transport. And the reason for that is simple, actually. And it's all about a thing called modal share. So that's the percentage of stuff and people that move around by different modes. So air, modal share is about 1.1%. Rail is about 10%. And as Tim said earlier, roads modal share is 89%. So 89% of people and stuff moves by road. That is why emissions are so high. And so I'm going to do a quick comparison between 2 things. So 2 scenarios. Scenario number 1 is if we fully decarbonize rail. So all of the greenhouse gas emissions of rail go to 0 overnight. So the equivalent of electrifying not just tracks, but also stations and sort of operations as well. Now compare that to a 10% modal shift towards rail. So that's reducing roads modal share down to 80%. So it's not hugely dramatic. That represents nearly 3 times more tons of CO2 equivalent being saved. So electrification is important, but it's not nearly as important as modal shift towards rail. So that's a really important thing to grasp. So that's why rail is a good idea. Is everyone following? I'll very briefly pause, just if nothing else, so I can breathe some air, because I don't think I've breathed yet. So just going to breathe some air. Was that all fairly familiar stuff, I think? Thumbs up from Tom, Andy, Tim's sort of nodding quietly. Nicola's giving me a thumbs up. Excellent. Thanks, everyone. I know I'm talking fast. Is everyone just about following? Some slow nods. I'll take that as like, sorry.
I'm not, but I'll keep quiet for now.
Sorry, Sarah Jane. I'm conscious of time. When it comes to the discussion section, I'll open out a bit and I'll be a bit slower. So hopefully that'll be more helpful. Thanks. Sorry. Next, I'll talk about high speed, and I will slow down as we get close to the HS2 specific stuff. I'll slow down a bit because it's stuff that I think is more important to dwell on. So broadly, why is high speed rail a good idea? Well, for the UK, it comes down to this issue that I call the mixed traffic problem, which is that Britain's railways generally mix different traffic types on the same lines. So we've got freight, we've got local services, rural services, metro services, medium distance regional services, long distance regional services. These all have different stopping patterns, different speeds. Trains with different performance characteristics and stopping patterns, they're constantly competing for space. So as I describe it, kind of Britain's railways are a jack of all trades and a master of none. And the trains that cause the biggest problems in terms of eating up capacity are these trains, the long distance high speed services. They have the biggest impact on capacity. Now, the reason for that is because so that they don't catch up the trains that are stopping at stations in front, you need to leave a big gap in the timetable so that they can go at full speed without catching anything up. In other words, everything else kind of has to get out of the way, which means you end up with a very empty railway. We're really not making the best use of the infrastructure we have. And it's these fast, long distance trains that are the problem. So to kind of explain what I mean by that in terms of impacting capacity, I'm going to talk about capacities of different railway lines and make the point about what the difference between a mixed traffic railway compared to a dedicated railway. So firstly, let's look at high speed 2. it can carry 20,000 passengers per hour per direction. So that's basically the number of seats per hour in one direction. HS2, when it's fully operational, nearly 20,000. Crossrail, the best part of 40,000. And that's because it goes a little bit slower, so you can squeeze even more trains in together. So Crossrail has an enormous capacity, just like Thameslink does. Thameslink has a capacity of about 40,000. Thameslink is the highest capacity railway system in the UK, operating in the UK at the moment. So these three are all dedicated systems. They have one type of traffic operating, and it means that trains can just conveyor belt. You compare that to the East Coast Main Line. So this is between York and London. Peak time capacity is about 5,000 seats per hour in one direction. So you can see there, the reason for that is because you've got this mixed traffic, trains mixing and essentially not making use of the infrastructure we have. So that's the challenge that we have. Now, the way we solve that is by essentially grouping the trains that have the closest performance together. So actually what that looks like is that most rail passenger services do about the same thing. They stop at all stations, they go about the same speed. Freight is a bit of an issue, but actually it's easier to mix freight and those passenger services than it is when you've got the long distance services on their own. So pulling out those long distance services onto their own line allows everything else to bunch up much more closely together, which allows a great leap in capacity approaching those dedicated systems like Crossrail and Thameslink. So that's why high-speed rail is a good idea. So I think that's basic, kind of fairly logical stuff, I think, so far. So that's why high-speed. Now we're going to get into HS2 itself. So here's a nice map of Britain at night. I'm Scottish, so I get to exclude everything north of Fife without people getting too angry about it. So that's kind of most of Britain. The major areas of population, you can kind of see them there from the night sky. They're kind of those clusters. So you can see there's the Scottish Central Belt, there's the Northeast. You've kind of got this huge cluster, the Midlands, Transpennine and Merseyside. There's York in the little top corner of that. South Wales and Bristol is kind of a fairly major hub. Greater London, and then the South Coast, sort of Bournemouth to Brighton, South Coast is sort of an urban hub. Probably not a particularly effective one because getting from Bournemouth to Brighton is a real pain in the backside. But anyway, those are sort of the UK urban hubs. And if you can imagine these are the clusters of cities connected by less than an hour's travel, and they've got a population larger than about 1 million. Now, the point of HS2 is to solve the capacity constraints I've just talked about by creating a north-south connecting route that goes from London up to Scotland and kind of joins the dots. North of the Midlands, it splits into two lines. The reason for that is essentially to allow taking traffic from the northeast down one leg and traffic from Scotland down the other leg. So essentially you get the benefit of serving the Leeds and the East Midlands with one route, and then the West Midlands going up to the kind of North Wales, the Northwest, and then up to Manchester, obviously, and then up to Scotland on the other leg. So that's the two phases there. So phase one is the connection from London to Birmingham, as I'm sure you all know, and phase two then is the connection up to Manchester on one side, and then to Leeds, actually up to Micklefield and Gareth on the other leg. That's the bit that we kind of is most relevant. And actually that bit, the Leeds to through the east, down south to the East Midlands and then connecting at Birmingham, that's the most important part of HS2 actually. But you can't have that part without the high-speed connector down to London. So there's a reason that there's a reason the London section is being built first, because in terms of whole network capacity, the largest challenge is that the lack of capacity approaching the London station, the London termini, is impacting on services right the way across the rest of the network. So that's why that bit part is being built first. And the need for speed. So I often get asked the question, yeah, but why does it need to be 320, 360 kilometers an hour? Ignore the 250 miles an hour stuff. That's nonsense. The alignment is being designed with passive provision, as we call it, for 400 kilometers an hour, but that's it. Just like the Selby diversion was designed to allow 160 miles an hour running at some point in the future, which it never will. It makes sense. They did it then, just the same as we are doing it now. But it's being built as a 360 kilometer an hour railway, and most trains won't run faster than 320 kilometers an hour, which is exactly the same as high-speed trains run in Europe. But the reason high speed is a good idea is because it means that you essentially get 3 north-south main lines for the price of 1. Now, why is that? And it's because you can take trains, for example, like most of the trains in the morning go direct from York to London, which means that you're running trains through a lot of stations without stopping and collecting passengers, which also means you're blitzing capacity through Doncaster, Retford, through Peterborough, Stevenage, all these places that deserve to have a much better, for example, there's one commuting train to Doncaster direct from York if you want to start work at 9 a.m. I know, because when I go to the college, it's the only one I have to get, and it's about 7:20, and I have to wait around in Doncaster for ages. That's rubbish. The two major cities in this part in Yorkshire, and they are connected by one train to commute. That's because of the fact that most of the trains from York go direct in the morning. So HS2 essentially it doesn't just do it for the West Coast Main Line. It's not just a bypass for the West Coast Main Line. Actually, it's for the West Coast Main Line and the Midland Main Line and the East Coast Main Line. So by taking all of those long distance services, putting them on their own dedicated line, you free up an enormous amount of space. And I think I've got a graphic that explains that. And it's not just those lines either. It's all the lines that connect into it. It's the cross-country route, of course, going down towards the southwest. Massive benefits on all those routes. Yeah, so I've just explained this. Yeah, by diverting long distance, yeah. So basically the point, the main headline, or one of the main headlines, is that the biggest benefit of HS2 is actually not on HS2, it's on the existing railway network. That is an absolutely key point to understand. If you don't understand, if that's not been explained, well, it hasn't been explained to most people, it's understandable you oppose HS2 if people aren't equipped with that information. And it's only up until very recently, HS2 weren't making the case, the DFT weren't making that case. So it extends beyond the north-south corridor, because all the removal of existing bottlenecks frees up capacity right the way across the country. So yeah, I give the Aberystwyth example. So my parents live near Aberystwyth, and you might say, why on earth does Aberystwyth benefit from HS2? How does that work? And it's a good way to explain why HS2 is so important for the existing railway network. So firstly, Aberystwyth trains run into Birmingham, they run through Birmingham New Street. They also run on the congested corridor between Wolverhampton and Birmingham International, so it's a really busy bit of railway. HS2, so often that those trains, they have to wait for platforms at New Street, they have to wait to actually get onto the line at Wolverhampton, they're sat waiting to join that line. HS2 takes all of those long distance services off the existing lines, away from the platforms at New Street that are so congested, into the new station at Curzon Street, and then when they're going north, the trains will bypass the whole lot and they'll connect up. They go up, have their own dedicated train tracks up to Manchester. So that means the Aberystwyth train won't be competing for space with an Avanti West Coast Pendolino that obviously is invariably given priority because it's the one that's the most late and so has the most catching up to do. So all of a sudden you can have a more reliable service to Aberystwyth. You have potential for more trains, potential for a consistent hourly service into Aberystwyth. All of that from HS2 all the way out in Aberystwyth in deepest, darkest mid-Wales in Ceredigion. So a high-speed rail network allows the railway to absorb future modal shift. That's the key thing. The reason why it's a good thing to have more local services, more regional services, is because those are the services that drive people out of their cars. HS2 is not about driving modal shift onto itself from a car perspective, although it'll do a little bit. The main benefit for people, so reducing that 89% of modal share being on the roads, is to get people out of their cars and onto local trains, so more viable commuting services, more freight. More freight is able to fit onto the existing network if HS2 allows those trains to run. By freeing up that capacity, HS2 allows more freight, so you can reduce the number of HGVs on the motorways as well. That's absolutely key, absolutely crucial point, is about the existing railway network. So I've already said the 3 new main lines for the price of 1 point. HS2 is the quickest and cheapest way to provide this step-changing capacity in our railway network. I say this as a railway engineer. The policy that the Green Party have about a new north-south line, HS2 is what 10 years of developing a north-south high-speed line will get you. If you started again, it would look like HS2. That is just because of the nature of politics, the nature of geography. If you started from scratch, HS2 is what you'd end up with again. It's just that you'd have wasted 10, 15 years of development time. The reason I say that it's the cheapest as well is because to achieve that benefit of, sorry, something very loud has just appeared in my ears. So forgive me for that, it's mildly distracted me. I say it's the cheapest and quickest is because to do the alternative, to get that benefit, that release capacity benefit, you need to add 2 extra tracks to each of those north-south main lines. You need to grade separate every single junction. You need to rebuild all of the major stations. All of these things, either it's work that HS2 is doing anyway, or they're things that would take enormously longer than a HS2 will. It will require huge amounts more engineers when we have an engineering skills shortage, and most crucially, will take a lot longer. And would cost a lot more, although frankly I don't care too much about cost because I'm a modern economist and don't believe that capital cost should be something we worry about in a modern economy. And hopefully no one on here cares about that because we're all progressives here. Modern monetary theory. Anyway, yeah, so anyway, there's some pictures of rebuilding. That's for the illustration for people who don't see railways getting rebuilt very often, but as an engineer doing it a lot, it's hard work. And it's time consuming and takes a lot of engineers. So yeah, the main benefit of HS2 isn't actually on HS2, I've said that. Massive amount of capacity released on the existing network, I've said that already as well. Means more local and freight services, I've said that too. Right, okay, here's some nice graphics that hopefully will make my case in a different way. So currently on the MML, this is the long distance capacity. So 2,000 passengers on the Midland Main Line per hour in one direction at peak time, 5,000 on the East Coast Main Line and 7,000 on the West Coast Main Line. HS2, so in total, that's 15,000-ish. HS2 off the bat will give, well, sorry, when it opens, will be almost a third more than that, 20,000. Now, if that means that you're absorbing those long distance passengers, so those passengers won't travel on the existing network anymore, they'll travel on HS2, which means that the existing network is able to do its job properly and start running intensive stop everywhere services. So that means that you can have a doubling or tripling of capacity. And in fact, lots of the capacity modeling has shown that you get potentially even more than a tripling of capacity on some lines. For example, on the line from Doncaster to Leeds, that at the moment is hogged by all the non-stop services that just stop at Wakey, if at all. Get rid of those services and you can run a really intensive high frequency service that goes between Donny and Leeds at peak time. So you have an enormous growth in potential capacity, and that's just looking at phase 1. That's ignoring the benefits of phase 2, which are, as I say, the most important part of HS2 is actually the leg from the East Midlands up to Leeds. It's not the end of the story. Obviously, Transpennine connectivity is very important. HS3 or whatever stupid political brand name it's getting called now. That's happening. It's a project that is happening. It's very important that it does happen. So that's connecting Liverpool across to York and then up towards the northeast. And then actually there needs to be more work down towards the southwest, Bristol and South Wales as well. So it's not the end of the story. We need to keep doing more of this. High-speed segregation just allows us to run more trains, more passenger services. And obviously going northwards as well, you know, Scotland's already talking about building its own high-speed line down to the border to connect to high-speed 2. And my personal opinion is that we need to be building a second East Coast main line that directly goes through Teesside up to Newcastle as well. But that's further in the future. Certainly the immediate projects are HS2 and then the Transpennine connectivity. Those are guaranteed projects. And if you want to look, so that's not the end of the story. There's more work being done on developing rail. Transport for the North have fallen a bit behind on publishing their plans for rail, actually, although they did publish something fairly recently. Midlands Connect, if you want to look at what's happening in the East Midlands and the West Midlands, huge amount of fantastic work going on in terms of making the most of that release capacity, building new, making additions to the existing railway network so that it works more like an intensive system rather than this kind of jack of all trades and master of none. Whew. Sorry, that was an intense little roar through YHS2. How are we doing time-wise? Someone shout at me about time.
That's fine. If you're wrapping up, yeah.
So the last 30 seconds to a minute and a half is going to be about what the future holds. It's not autonomous vehicles. Shout at anyone who says that it's autonomous vehicles because that's just vaporware. And indeed, it's not electric vehicles, actually. Batteries are an environmental and a socioeconomic nightmare already. And the idea that we can get the materials to build enough batteries to fully electrify our road fleet with battery power is just nonsense. It's utter nonsense. It just moves the problem from an environmental perspective. And there just isn't enough. There isn't enough of those materials. They're dubiously sourced materials already. So we need to be recycling the existing battery materials that we have, but a massive conversion. What is it? Electric cars now make up like 1% of cars or something, 2% tops. to turn that to 100% requires a frightening amount of batteries. We just don't have those materials. So that's not, so electric vehicles are certainly the future for cars, but cars are not the future of travel. Another nonsense, Hyperloop, it's nonsense. Again, it's vaporware. It's just made up stuff to raise venture capital for some people who just don't like trains. Yeah, ignore that. It's just rubbish. It's basically maglev with a Hoover. Just ignore it. If anyone suggests it's a good idea. What else? Yeah, so Hyperloop. So if people say it's happening, it's not. It's just not happening. So just ignore that. As I say, it's the past. Maglev is happening in Japan and China only because they've finished 2 absolutely massive and exhaustive high-speed rail networks. And it's about capacity. Those systems just don't carry enough people compared to kind of high-speed rail or metro rail. They're the past. So yeah, my little bit on the future is, are we talking about science fantasy tomorrow or the transport solutions that we already have today? As I often tell people, we've solved transport. It's been solved. We've done it. We just need to build it. Okay, so there's some questions I often get asked about destroying ancient woodland, and I'll raise the point that the Lower Thames crossing, which is being built down, well, funnily enough, at the lower end of the Thames, impacts on as much ancient woodland as HS2 does, except that it's only 14 miles long. So it's really important to get an idea of scale here. And the other point is, yeah, there's often the raise about, oh, we're in the midst of climate emergency, HS2's carbon footprint is too much, we need to just not be building anything. I'll just raise the point that the total GHG emissions released during the construction of phase 1, actually, it's about 10 million for the whole of HS2. And that's actually operational as well. So this slide is a little out of date. So the operational and construction emissions are less than 1 month of UK road transport. So scale, it's really important that we need to reduce those emissions from construction as much as we possibly can. But scale is really important, and we have to understand that if we don't build HS2, if we don't build sustainable transport infrastructure, don't expand railway capacity, it's not a zero-sum game. That means that we're being left with the status quo, which is 90% modal share to roads. There we are, a nice picture of HS2. Anyway, right, I'm going to get rid of this and bring my face back. Sorry, I hammered through that, but hopefully that was useful. I have no idea in Zoom how to unshare my screen, so I'm just going to let someone else break it for me. Tom, stop it. Stop it for me. I'm lost.
Okay.
Are we allowed to? Am I allowed to ask any questions?
Yeah, this is question time. Definitely. Yep.
Well, when I was a very young woman, I worked in York, itemising bits of the railway to be sold. It valued little bits and stuff by sleepers and things like that. Do we know who owns all the sleepers and everything now?
So do you mean so are you just talking broadly about lines that have been closed whether they should be reopened again?
No, I'm asking who actually owns all the sleepers exactly now.
As in the sleepers the ones that were sold off originally?
Yeah.
Most of those either went into being reused elsewhere in the network or will have been crushed and scrapped. Yeah.
Right, and the high-speed rail trains, is it a deal with China we had about that or not?
No, China's not involved in HS2 at all.
Right.
Okay.
Okay.
What I'd like to do now, hang on, Martina, is I was wondering if Jonathan would like to say anything, because Jonathan is a railway timetabler, I think. Jonathan, can you unmute
I'm sweating.
yourself?
Where's William Barton when you need him? Crikey. Sorry, Jonathan, go on.
It's on mute, I think, at the moment, Jonathan.
Yeah, I'm just.
Jonathan, you need to unmute.
I have asked to unmute. So, Jonathan, you will need to unmute yourself, which should be at the bottom left-hand corner.
Oh,
That's
I
good.
think
Great. Jonathan?
He's not on sound.
Right. Okay, that's a great shame.
If Jonathan wants to type a question, I'm happy to answer that. We can field some
In
other
the
questions,
chat.
and then I can
a
answer.
comment,
in the chat. Yeah.
a comment, or a comment.
Has he not got a
Okay,
microphone? Hmm.
so Martina, you wanted to say something?
Yes. Well, I mean, this was, as you said, Gareth, quite a skip and a hop through all of that stuff, and a lot of it is, you know, important and complicated. So I've tried to keep up with both of your presentations in terms of the questions that I think are the most important to ask. And I think the first one is that both of you assume that capacity needs to be either at the level that we're using transport in general now or go up. And I don't actually think that that is necessarily the case.
So can I answer these in turn? Is that, because otherwise I'll end up forgetting? Is that all right, Martina? So I'll address each point. So my, because it's probably worth it. So that point, no, I don't think we need to be. So even with less travel overall, and the Centre for Alternative Technology actually has confirmed this in various reports recently, and they updated it quite recently. To have more, we're not talking about more travel overall, we're talking about modal shift away from roads. So we have 90% of stuff and people are moved on our roads, and we need to reduce that. And the only way to reduce that is by people and things moving around by rail. We can't get rid of those journeys, and them not, those journeys are not going to disappear into thin air to drive, not at the rate at which we need to be reducing emissions. So we're not talking about we're not talking about growth of travel. We're talking about reducing travel, but also driving modal shift away from roads. So that's why we need more rail capacity.
Yeah, I think I did try and pick up on that in what I said earlier, that yes, absolutely, we want to reduce the need to travel, but the travel that does remain, we want more people to travel by public transport rather than by road, because it's quite a staggering figure to see nearly 90% of journeys by road.
Yeah.
And we've seen, you probably see it in York, but certainly here our road network's right back up to where it was before the crisis.
Absolutely. And putting my socialist hat on, you have to be very careful when you talk about reducing journeys, because that, in lots of the discussions I've had, it often ends up with regressive policy, where actually you're impacting on the worst off. So the people who end up not being able to drive, if you're going to continue with the status quo and not reduce the cost of fares are a very important thing. To reduce the cost of rail travel, the only thing that really allows you to do that is increasing capacity. Fares are too high. I want fares to reduce. But that cannot happen now because there's not enough capacity on the rail network. If you did it, you'd end up, okay, forget COVID for now, because that's something that is transient and we're going to be back to normal again within a year or two. And this railway is a 200-year asset. So we need to think of a bigger picture. So I'm going to we'll just assume COVID, unless there's a specific question, I'll just assume a pre-COVID world. Or assume a post-COVID world, perhaps, is a better way to describe that. Yeah. So fares need to come down, but the only way to do that is to increase capacity so that you can have, so that you can basically pull down the face value fare. Demand is what drives fares. So fares is a very important thing, but we have to make sure we do. There's a risk where if you just create policy to stop people from traveling, the rich people in the high income, high earners are the ones who will then be able to flout that, and people who are the worst off in society will be the ones who are hit hardest. So as a socialist, for me, I want to be creating the opportunities for people to travel, but to do so without any carbon emissions. That for me is the right thing to do. And that will then be paired with policy to reduce transport overall. But in terms of reducing transport emissions, as you can see, we've had 30 years, my entire life, of not reducing carbon emissions from transport. The only way to do that is to drive modal shift away from roads.
Moving on from that, I mean, you said that this is all about modal shift in the commuter railways, but there are vast quantities of the country where there aren't any railways at all, and they won't be built by building HS2. So wouldn't it be more sensible to build commuter railways in the areas where currently there isn't a rail network, and not focus everything on in and out of London, because that's part of the real problem we have.
So yeah, that's an interesting point. So to answer that one, firstly, do both. There is no economic sound reason for us not to be borrowing the money to be delivering HS2 and lots of other projects. Zero, it's economically illiterate to suggest otherwise.
It's an investment, isn't it?
It's an investment. So it comes from...
It shouldn't be viewed as a cost, really.
So the first thing is we should be doing both. Secondly, in terms of maximizing your benefit in terms of carbon that you're emitting in construction and in terms of time, because this is a race against time, we're in a climate emergency. The way to decarbonize most quickly is to focus on areas that have very high flows of traffic, road, rail, whatever, but road traffic as well. And so those are the areas where we do have established rail networks. And so I fully agree that we should be reopening railway lines. I fully support, or sorry, no, not reopening railway lines, opening new railway lines that perhaps might use old routes, but new railway lines that serve the markets in terms of serve people where they are now. There are quite a few lines that should be built, particularly up in the northeast of Scotland where I grew up actually, areas that are quite large populations without any rail. But that shouldn't happen. There's no reason for that not to happen as well as HS2 going ahead. None at all, other than the skills shortage. But HS2 is a large project, and it's the large projects that generally drive an upscaling of the market across the country. Well, there were 2 points in there as well, there weren't there? Sorry, what was, Martina, there were two. Your first point was about new lines. Have I answered? Sorry, have I answered? Did that make sense?
Absolutely. The third point I want to make, and I'll leave it at that then, is I think it was Tim who said that Green parties in other European countries are supporting high-speed rail, which to a certain extent is true. But has anybody looked at the geography of Britain as compared to France and Germany and measured the distances?
They're the same. The distances are the same. I hear this a lot. So Britain the distances are the same. Yeah. So Britain is about, in terms of, Britain's the perfect size to have a high-speed rail network. It's the distances are, rail is competitive with air, which means that you can have policy that just gets rid of domestic flights. It's the distances are the same as they are in France, Germany, Spain. It's the same.
The population density is obviously different, and our planning laws are different. So to build something like this takes a lot longer in the UK because of our planning system and the need to obviously compensate people. So there is a higher concentration of population around the route, inevitably.
Well, I mean, it's quite obvious that we're not really having a conversation, but a contest in who can bat whose arguments down.
I hope it doesn't come across that way. Yeah. I suppose the challenge is that lots of the talking points that we have come up already. So I'm trying to be reasonably succinct in responding to them, so as many people can ask questions.
Completely off the wall. I was wondering, are there currently any underground roads or railway networks? Sorry, I read when I was a young girl, and like there was all the clouds and travel on the top, at the top of the tree, and the Pixie Railway underneath the ground. I'm wondering, as far as goods are concerned and so on, whether there are currently things going on underground, because for instance, it's puzzled me for a long time how lorries get to Morrison's in Acombe without going, right, I know that sounds really weird, but it's, I don't understand that. The evidence.
I mean, there are suburban underground railway networks like the one in London, the London Underground. But I think the key challenge in terms of connectivity across the country, people do often ask the question, well, why can't you just put all of HS2 underground? Why can't it just be in a fully underground railway? The challenge with that is that the carbon cost of burying and tunneling and lining a tunnel system like that would be enormous. It would be a huge, you're talking about probably 10 times the carbon emissions of the railway building it that way, which that's at the point where we do not, at that point you're talking about carbon emissions where the railway, you have to rethink the project. So Jonathan sent a couple of comments through that I'd like to address, if that's all right.
If we just read them out, because I'm not sure they're up here in the recording.
Jonathan's first point is there has never been a proper study of how best to achieve your very important objectives. It is not obvious that a hugely expensive new railway is the best solution, and we need action now, not in the 2030s. So to respond to that, there have been about 15 years of studies More than that, in fact, British Rail had suggested that there should be a north-south high-speed rail connection through the 1980s. In fact, there are some interesting reports of precisely that. And again, it was brought up in the 90s after the Channel Tunnel was opened. As the Channel Tunnel was being built, the discussion was that it would have a high-speed rail connection going right the way north to Scotland. This isn't a new, and in fact, high-speed rail as a concept in the UK has been discussed as part of the solution for decades. In terms of HS2, we've got 15 years of reports, of studies. So it's not, however, I do take the point that there has never been a proper academic study of driving modal shift across transport. And that's partly a problem with the UK just not having a very joined up thought on transport connectivity. So I kind of, I agree with, to an extent, that there's not been a wider view of what an integrated transport system, what an integrated transport policy might look like. But that's because the DfT hates making any policy or doing anything at all other than perhaps specifying Wi-Fi and hardness of seats when it comes to railways. But in terms of the expensive,
we do need it.
Yeah, the hugely expensive new railway statement, it's not hugely expensive. It's about the same cost as equivalent high-speed lines globally that do the same thing. The reason it looks cheap, the reason that other railways occasionally look cheap, or often look cheap, particularly when I'm looking to France and Spain, is because they don't put all the stuff into one headline cost. They do it in lots of little bits. So the massive station upgrade, like at Euston, is its own project. So that doesn't count as the high-speed line project. The high-speed line, for when you're looking at Spain or France, is just the bit of new railway line out on its own. So that's why the unit costs often look different. But actually, HS2 is broadly in line with the cost you'd expect for a line of that type globally. It's certainly, it's until the recent cost increase, it was the same cost per mile as HS1. And it's substantially cheaper than things like Crossrail and other lines. So the next point from and we need action now, not in the 2030s. Yeah, fully agree. HS2 is not all the money that's being spent on the railways. Actually, it's only about half the money that's being spent on the railways. Every year, Network Rail spends around about £7 billion on the railway network. HS2 is about, at its peak, will be about 2 or 3 billion a year. So Network Rail, they're the manager of the existing railway infrastructure, spend a lot more than HS2 will spend a year. So it's that's another really important point to grasp. We're spending that money now on the railway. Also, as I said, there's no reason not to be investing more on other projects elsewhere. So Jonathan's next statement is, if I'll just go through these, if that's all right with everyone. Jonathan fears that I'm exaggerating releasable capacity. There's been no thorough study of what can actually be delivered. Jonathan is actually right on that. He's absolutely right. On the thorough study, there hasn't been a thorough study of what the release capacity looks like on the existing network. However, wherever there has been a study looking in isolation, the numbers are either a doubling or a tripling of capacity. And I also you can see what the capacity is like for Crossrail, for Thameslink. That's when you have a dedicated infrastructure with dedicated services for high capacity commuting. That's what we can be aiming for, given the infrastructure that, Thameslink runs a lot of it on the existing network, on the existing railway, and it still gets those high capacities. So yes, the releasable capacity has not been studied enough. No, I'm not exaggerating. And if you want to increase rail's modal share, why go for a route where it's already high? It's already high in relation to rail, but road is still huge the reason it's high is because that's the high density parts of the country in terms of population. But if you look at the road density map, you'll see that all the areas where HS2 goes is where the highest levels of congestion and therefore air pollution and obviously then GHG emissions are. So the reason you're building a line to serve areas where rail does all right already is because we can make it do even better. The idea that rail's at capacity, it's like pumping air into a tire. When that tire starts when you're reaching the point where you've pumped the right amount of air in, it starts getting really hard to pump more air into it. The railway is the same. We've filled up the tire and it's getting very hard to pump any more air into it. In this case, air is an analogy for passengers. So that's everything from Jonathan. Yeah.
Sorry, is anyone sponsoring HS2?
Government.
It's the UK government.
It's a government project. A lot of people, occasionally I get people talking about, take shares up in HS2 or do. HS2 Limited is just part of the DFT. It's a way of project managing a major project. Crossrail had its own company as well, Crossrail Limited. It's a way that we've been delivering major civil engineering projects for the last 20 or 30 years, but it's a state project. You know, HS2 is a state project. And as of a month ago, the entire railway network, including train operations, is nationalised as well. So there's a decent chance that HS2 will be a fully nationalised service, to be honest.
It's certainly heading that direction.
I've got a question, which is, we've seen a lot of these projects where they get cancelled in the north. We've seen, for instance, the improvements on Transpennine cancelled, I think now 5 times, but that may be wrong. Why do you think HS2B will happen apart from Birmingham North? I'm fairly convinced that it's not going to happen because they'll run out of money and say, oh, that's too expensive. You can just have slow trains from there north and you wouldn't then get 95% of the benefits you're claiming.
So yeah, it's a very, very good question. And it's one that my answer to it is, there are a few things involved. Firstly, that there is cross-party political support for this project, and that includes the later stages. So it's really key that we push, and there have already been echoes. Dominic Cummings, the nasty little rat, has already been, I can say this sort of thing, because even if it's recorded, because I don't work for anyone who's written down, so that's fine. I can be mean about people who are obviously a nasty piece of work. Dominic Cummings hates this project, and he's tried to demolish it. He's tried to end it several times, and now his thing he's trying to do is to stop the most important part, which is from Birmingham up to Leeds. He's trying to stop that from happening. The reason I say that's the most important part is because that's the bit that releases all the capacity on the Midland Main Line and the East Coast Main Line. So for us in York, obviously, that's a major benefit. And also the cross-country route. So all the services that go down from Newcastle to Birmingham, obviously you get that benefit there of the journey time halves from Leeds to Birmingham. So my answer to the question is, looking at the current political landscape, Boris Johnson has already said he's doing loads of stuff for the north. That's like his thing, wasn't it? And although it was mostly about Brexit, he's trying to convince everyone that he won his votes in the north because he promised that he would deliver stuff for the north. And if he cancelled a major project, it would turn HS2 into being the London. If you cancel the northern parts of HS2, it does become a London-centric project. It isn't a London-centric project now. People often say that. It is not. HS2 is very much not. The main benefits of HS2 are outside of the M25. So, but if you cancel that leg, it doesn't work. So I answer that with a little bit of hope in that the point at which that can get cancelled is quite a long way away. And we are still in the process of that becoming a piece of legislation. Once it's a piece of legislation, it's fine. It can't be cancelled. Well, yeah, Tom, I do agree with your raised eyebrows as well. There's an element of hope in this. Like, yes, I agree there is that risk, but I think that's not a reason to oppose the project. It's not a reason because, even in the future, you need the lower bits to build the northern bit. You need the connection to London because obviously the trains have to go, they need their own. If they get clogged up on the existing network at the southern end, then you're back to square one again. You've got the same problem. So you need the whole thing. You need the bit to London. You need the northern parts. It's not a reason to oppose the project. It's a reason to not vote Conservative. But anyway, there we go.
Plenty of reasons not to vote.
Okay.
If we need any more.
Just on that particular point about the northern part, I mean, that when it was first talked about, there was quite a strong push to have start from the north. We're saying in terms of regeneration, it would have been far better to actually start construction from the north, and that would have been more convincing that it was of benefit for the north rather than the other way around.
Yeah, politically, I agree that it would have been useful to, certainly from a political perspective, and indeed from a local development perspective, to started it in at the northern end, Manchester and Leeds, and work southwards. The challenge is that the hardest parts of the line are in and around London. So from an engineering planning perspective, it makes sense to start in London. Also, if you don't build the London bit first, you've got nowhere to send all of those trains. So there's a huge number of trains that will be running down from both the Leeds leg and the Manchester leg. If you don't build the London bit, not all of those trains can run into Curzon Street. So not all the trains will go into Curzon Street. Some of them will go straight down south. If you don't build the southern bit, then essentially what you do is you half the number of services you can run on the northern legs. So there is an operational and an engineering reason for doing the southern leg first. The bit from Old Oak Common up to Birmingham Interchange is essentially a conveyor belt of trains. There's going to be an enormous, about 18 trains per hour. It's a huge number of trains in each direction.
Just another question is, like, in terms of how you described the sort of the problem between fast and slow trains, essentially. The logic of that is that as soon as HS2 starts operating, then there will be far fewer affordable sort of normal high speed trains. So basically you sort of create a luxury class for business use.
It's a good question and a good point. And I always have an answer. I know it seems like I always have an answer. It's because I have answered these
obviously, yeah.
on Twitter. So the reason, so for this one, HS2's whole model, the whole ticketing model and the fare model and the demand model has been built based on the fact that it'll have precisely the same ticket fare costs as the trains that it replaces. So all the trains that basically the trains that then divert onto HS2 will have the same fare as the day before the Avanti service. It'll be the same fare as when you get onto a HS2 train. And that's a really fundamental element in the whole operating model. If you price people off it, it won't work and the whole thing falls down.
So I mean, equally, the logic is that we should get rid of we should tie in from a climate change perspective, you should tie in the complete ban on domestic flights that are competing with it, because at the moment they don't pay the taxes that you pay on the rail transport, and then they're far cheaper.
Yeah, I've seen them. So yeah,
so the logic is that we'd have to ban the domestic flights that compete with the.
So this is a drum, exactly. So this is a drum that I bang very firmly. Is that HS2 enables us to essentially get rid of all kind of mainland domestic flights in the UK. Okay, there's perhaps an argument for Inverness, London, maybe, but even then, I'm saying, yeah, but climate change, get the sleeper train. You know, there's a.
Yeah.
Gareth, what you said.
Sorry, Tom.
Gareth, what you said about fares didn't apply certainly with HS1, where I know people in Ashford who used to commute into Charing Cross and now, which they find less convenient, have to go into King's Cross, but they're also paying a lot more because all the trains that went into Charing Cross were cancelled, and even if they've been willing to take a slower train, there's now sort of one train a day, which is just unsuitable time, a bit like you're going to Doncaster. So they're forced onto a much more expensive train, and I strongly suspect that we will see that. The other thing I wanted to raise is it's not properly connected in with the rest of the network. So you've got Curzon Street as a separate station from New Street or Moore Street in Birmingham. It's going to be a separate station in Leeds, which means that people are going to have to drive to use HS2. So instead of seeing people take a local train to Birmingham and then Birmingham New Street to London, you're going to drive to Curzon Street, and you're not only going to see part of the modal shift that you want, because you'll be forcing other people to drive into city centres to take a train to London.
So yeah, those are both points I want to address because they're both very important points. On the HS1 comparison, there's always that risk that can happen. We've got the country's currently in charge. The people in charge of the country currently are just they embody incompetence and callousness. So there is always that risk. However, HS2 is a very different railway. It was like the fast lines, the fast trains running on HS1 were essentially a bit of a, oh, let's do that. We've got this railway and it's only connecting to the Channel Tunnel. Maybe we can do that with it. And that was, so it was not a railway designed operationally in the same way that HS2 has been. So, and fundamentally, if you run HS2 like that, it doesn't solve the problem. So the HS2 is being built for a purpose, and it's to solve that congestion capacity constraint issues. If you price people off, or if you deprecate the existing, if you price them off or give them no choices, then it won't work, and everyone who's been involved in it will have egg on their face. Fundamentally, it's designed and will be built to solve a problem, and if you price people off, it won't solve that problem. And then on the not connected issue, I don't agree that HS2 isn't connected for example, so Curzon Street is a 5-minute walk from New Street, which isn't ideal, but it's not too bad. It's going to be wired into, it's going to be directly connected to Moore Street. So Moore Street's going to be expanded, and it sits right next to Curzon Street. So Curzon Street and Moore Street will almost become one station. So a lot of the suburban services that run through Moore Street currently will connect. You'll be able to walk along a kind of a pedestrian walkway, and you just go straight down to the HS2 platforms. In Leeds, again, it's not a different station; it's the same station. The station's being built with additional T. It's becoming a T shape, but there's not sufficient land on the existing east-west route corridor to widen the station because of the position of buildings and the river adjacent to it. Hence why the additional terminal platforms are being built butting up onto that as a T shape, but it's one station. It'll have one concourse. It's being built as one station. Old Oak Common connects the Great Western Main Line directly into HS2 and to Crossrail. So that means that actually it might be quicker to go from Birmingham. If we in York, it's probably going to be quicker for us to go HS2 down to Old Oak Common and then get the Great Western service across to Bristol than to get on a cross-country train, and changing it to New Street off HS2 and onto the cross-country service. So I don't agree with the lack of connectivity argument, because to an extent HS2 has to not be fully wired into the existing network, because there's the risk that it then becomes as much mixed traffic as the existing network, and you're back to square one again. But in terms of the stations, I think given the engineering compromises that have to be made at places like Leeds and Birmingham, I think it's pretty well wired into the network. I admit in Birmingham's case, I would have preferred there to be a Hauptbahnhof style New Street suburban platforms, and then underneath it, the high-speed platforms going on through there. But Britain we have a nasty habit of shrink wrapping our infrastructure and and designing it for what we think is a good idea 20 years ago rather than looking to the future. Sorry, that was a long answer. Any other questions?
Sarah, I think you wanted to read something.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I was just going to mention something about just worry about the safety of the high speed and the thing given sort of rising temperatures and stuff like that.
That's a good question. So one of the advantages of building a brand new railway is that we can design everything as a part of it. The reason, for example, the reason we're having lots of landslides on the existing railway infrastructure is because they were built at a time when civil engineers didn't really have an understanding of mud as a structural material. So we just kind of heaped the mud up, put the railway on top and hope for the best. Whereas since the middle of the last century, we've had a much better understanding of how to use soil as a material to build things. So the advantage of a new build railway is that everything can be built in such a way that it is climate resilient. So not just earthworks, but also you talk about temperatures and tracks. So on the existing railway, lots of risks of buckling rails. That's not an issue on HS2 because it's being laid in slab track, which is sort of, rather than sleepers as you were describing earlier, it's sort of a fixed lump of concrete with the rails placed into it. So the advantage of a new railway is that we can build it to be climate resilient. It's a good question.
Any other questions?
Andy Dearden, I think, had a, yeah. Andy, hello. Are you muted though?
Hello, yes, it's Tom just picks on me. That's all it is.
It keeps happening to all of us.
He picks on all of us. Yes. No, it was just in terms of the kind of political support for this. I just wondered about your responses to that idea of e-motorways and sort of replacing trucks with sort of trolley buses and essentially sort of electrifying the inside lane of motorways and delivering trucks that way, and what that does to the modal shift questions and freight issues. So not whether or not it's a good idea, but politically, where does it put us?
Yeah, so I had the privilege of actually riding in the cab of one of those in Sweden. It was quite fun, and it's part of a big. I'm not going to talk about yes or no, but it's part of a bigger picture. But in terms of the political elements, the modal shift elements, the challenge remains that if we move into policy, so assuming we get a chance to actually implement useful policy, so we eventually finally bin off the psychopaths we've had in government for over a decade, and we actually put some humans in charge. We're going to imagine the fact that we're going to need to start rolling out ultra low emission zones in cities, right? And not just in cities, but actually in larger built up towns. That means that you need to have a transfer of goods from your HGV into a smaller van or which means that if you're introducing introducing an interchange, a kind of from one mode to another, then it undermines the value in buying an incredibly expensive electrified lorry, as opposed to just putting it on rail and having an interchange to rail. So rail freight is just on the cusp of a massive opportunity. If we introduce ultra low emission zones across towns and cities in the UK, HGVs not being able to run into, to the Morrisons in Acomb, meaning they have to have a logistics interchange at the edge of the town. That means that hauliers are going to be less interested in converting their HGV fleet if rail is there ready to be the alternative. So as I see it from an operational perspective, that's how it fits in, whether or not the technology is good or bad. From an economics perspective, if you're making an interchange, why not, for the core route, make it as energy efficient as possible, and rail fulfills that. The expensive bit of moving stuff around is generally interchanging it. It's not so much the journey, it's the interchange. So at the moment, HGVs are good because there's no interchange. You get it off the ship, goes onto your lorry, and it arrives at the customer. Whereas ultra low emission zones mean that you're introducing unavoidable interchanges, at which point the core bit might as well be rail. Does that answer your question? Sorry, I don't know if that...
Well, it's an interesting response. Yeah, it was more a sort of thinking about that pattern, that idea of electric HGVs, but also whether they, I can imagine the DFT thinking, oh yeah, that's great. So we don't have to change our way of thinking anymore. Yeah. We doesn't demand rethinking.
And the challenge is that you're not going to electrify all of the roads in a town, which means that your electrified HGV is going to then have to go either by diesel or battery in the town. And then we're back to batteries being a massive issue, or just emitting loads of emissions still in the city centre. So yeah, it's certainly not a technology to dismiss, but I think by the time other things are happening, like ultra low emission zones, the other policy, kind of the landscape in terms of environmental policy, you might find that that's just a waste of effort, and you might as well just expand rail capacity, which of course HS2 is an important part of doing it.
One of the objections I've always had to HS2 is that by increasing capacity into London, which it does do for long distance trains, as your figures showed, we increase the hot housing of London and increase its dominance in the economy. And even if it will support modal shift, it is actually disastrous for the UK economy as a whole, or at least for the UK economy outside London and possibly, well, the very greater London area, let's say, sort of the M25 and a bit beyond that.
Yeah, I get that one a lot too. And I suppose it comes back to the fact that people look at HS2 as just being HS2. Actually, HS2's main benefits are outside of the M25 by an order of magnitude. I can't say by an order of magnitude. I don't have any numerical justification for that, but by a long way. The reason I say that is because actually public transport, commuting transport, and modal share within the M25 is actually pretty good for rail. It's actually really good for rail. The reason for that is because you can turn up at a station and you don't care when the next train's going to turn up, because it arrives in 2 minutes and off you go. So the reason why I just fundamentally do not think that the idea that HS2 is just London centric and just helps London is right, is because HS2's main benefit is allowing lines like the Cross City line in Birmingham. It frees up loads of capacity to run many more trains along the Castlefield corridor through Manchester. It enables Leeds to have a leap in the number of high density services running through along, particularly coming in from Harrogate or coming down the Aire Valley. Huge leaps. So actually, and those benefits, you won't see those benefits in London, because London is already kind of running a far better suburban and urban railway network. So whilst London won't see that huge leap in urban capacity, everywhere, like lots of places outside of London will. So it's about, so the reason why that doesn't stand up is because of that, the main benefit of HS2 not being on HS2. It's actually on the existing railway network, and for those urban and suburban networks in cities outside of London.
But it's not just about that. I mean, one of the things we're seeing is, for instance, there was a, I forget which development it was, but one of the ones off Stonegate, was actually sort of advertising itself as a great place for when HS2 comes, because it'll be commutable to London. And so we're sort of seeing London commuter land being extended, and London, that increasing the dominance of London in the economy.
Yeah,
and I don't think what you're saying addresses that.
Yeah, that's a fair point. But again, that, yes, businesses are advertising that point because they can, but that, as I say, that doesn't represent the majority of what HS2 achieves. So, you know, the majority of people who travel long distance are actually leisure travelers, students. It's not actually the business fraternity. It's just a, so the idea that, you know, businesses will use the "we're quicker to London" element because, you know, like myself, I'm in meetings in London, you know, in post-COVID world, I'm sure I will be again. I'm in meetings in London pretty frequently. I always get the train. And that, so actually, the way that enables business isn't so much that people are just going to move their offices to London. It's actually that you can run businesses in other parts of the country and have your, whenever you need to go down to London for a thing or a meeting or a conference or a seminar or whatever it is, you've got the ability to do that much more easily. So I don't buy that. I just, from my perspective, when people say HS2 is London centric, it's generally because it's the lack of understanding of that suburban and urban release capacity benefit.
I did live in London until recently.
Yeah. Well, it's nice enough, isn't it? You know, you can get good food there. But actually, we you know, the cuisine's not bad in York, so yeah, it's probably better than Solihull. Sorry, Tim. Where is he? No, he's gone. No,
He's had to go into the planning meeting.
Yeah, sorry.
Okay,
anyway, I'll be trying. It's a valid point, and again, it's one that if policy is wrong, if we continue to have a Conservative government for the next 20 years, then we might be in a position where some of the nice things I'm talking about collapse. But frankly, if we've got a Conservative government for another 20 years, there are going to be other fish to fry. This will be a dystopia. Like, I'll have left the country. Like, people won't, like, Britain will be an absolute disaster zone if that happens. So, and likewise, if we've not made the policy changes to, for example, if road pricing hasn't come in within the next 5 to 10 years, we're going to be in, you know, HMT won't have any VED. It's just, you know, there are policy things that need, HS2 can't exist in a vacuum. If we haven't made major positive changes to policy to support, you know, to reduce our emissions and to generally support the environment, we'll have bigger fish to fry, frankly. We'll all have to grow gills.
Thanks. Are there any other questions, comments, thoughts?
It's been a really good discussion.
Oh,
it's been a good discussion.
Andy.
I've enjoyed that. Andy, go on, yeah. Oh, he's muted. Andy, you're muted.
I was trying to maybe Andy.
Unmute.
Thanks, Madeline, by the way. Pleasure to have you on.
Is that better? Can you hear me?
Oh, Andy, yeah, we've got you.
Yeah, no, it was just a recent Transport for the North meeting I attended. One of the projects that is still, I think it was probably about 5 or 6 years old, but it's still on the books that they're spending more money on, is a potential east-west road route, a tunnel under the Peak District. And like, I think they said it was estimated about £12 billion cost.
Yeah,
and yet there's no money, and like they say, there's no money for electrifying the line. You know, they're not going to electrify the whole line between Leeds and Manchester.
This is I cannot express politely how angry it makes me that we're still talking about that stupid thing. Not us, but the government and Transport for the North are talking about that. Transport for the North are a bit of I have a mixed. It's the same with all of these subnational transport bodies. Is that because because there's an element of quite a heavy political involvement in them, you know, which is good because it means that they're accountable locally. It means they talk about roads a lot, because the road lobby is strong, very, very strong. And this stupid this tunnel project was sort of half shelved. Dominic Cummings and Boris have brought it back up because it looks like a happy win. but it's a disgusting waste of everything. Like we have an so for everyone who's on the call who doesn't know what I'm talking about, this is a project, a motorway tunnel to connect Sheffield and Manchester. So bypassing the Snakehead Pass and going underneath Woodhead, well, not underneath Woodhead actually, it's kind of a bit further south than that, but essentially it's a massive motorway junction to sort of skip past that at the moment pretty rubbish road connection. Now the trouble with that is that we've understood this thing called induced demand for about 100 years now. All that'll do is get full immediately, and it'll just create an enormous increase, a huge leap in horrendous GHG emissions. Plus the fact that it's just like, so we've got an opportunity with the Snake Pass. That's a rubbish road. Good. It should remain a rubbish road. It gives us an opportunity to expand. As long as it's safe, use average speed cameras to make sure that they're, reduce the speed so it's safe. That's the perfect opportunity for us to be expanding rail capacity.
Upgrading the railway lines.
So there is a project. There is a project.
Yeah,
there is a project to upgrade the Hope Valley, which is the connection. But that's been on the Transport Secretary's desk for about 5 years without having moved.
Yeah.
As I say, government intransigence, and not just this government, I'm afraid to say, every single government since the 90s has been worse than useless when it comes to transport. New Labour were dismal as well, absolutely dismal when it comes to transport.
Where are you buying the new trains from?
That's being announced later this year. So it'll either be, it's like Bombardier or Hitachi. So the trains are being built, will be built in the UK, which is good because at least it reduces their transport emissions to get them onto the railway. So either it'll be built by Talgo, which is a Spanish company, or Hitachi. Hitachi Bombardier they've got combined. So there are a few different companies on the table for that. Martina, yeah. Oh, you're on mute, but that's.
I know.
Perfect.
Talking about who's building the trains and stuff reminded me of another question I had, which is you're talking about shifting up the capacity of regional and commuter trains and all that good stuff. They don't have the rolling stock. Who's paying for that? And how is that factored into the overall cost of this glorious panacea?
Well, the point of HS2 is that it isn't a glorious panacea. It's just it's a stepping stone to enabling all this other stuff to happen. You need to procure we need to procure new rolling stock, and rolling stock procurement in this country. So when I say rolling stock, sorry, that's a bit of a jargon term. I mean trains, new trains. Trains. The procurement of new trains has been absolutely shambolic in this country for actually since probably the early 90s, and the privatization is a major part of that, but it's not the whole picture. But broadly, it's because we just don't like railways in this country. We like them, but we don't want to build them or expand them or make them better. And that includes procuring new stock. And so you see all the shambles that's happened over the last 2 years of all this stock that should have arrived, and then it's caused delays and then timetable problems. And it's because we have a supply chain that goes from boom to bust. So we deliver a load of new trains, so like we've just done now, a huge spike in the number of new coaches that have been delivered. And then we're looking at a cliff edge within the next 6 months, and nothing's being ordered. So that means the whole industry will pack in again. All those skills will be lost. So what we need is a proper rolling stock strategy. And we need to be building the stock so HS2 is going to start, will be fully operational in the mid to late 2030s. By that point, we need to have built a lot more rolling stock. Absolutely agree. And HS2, the key point is that HS2 shouldn't include all those extra costs. What we need is a plan. And it's something that the Department for Transport uniquely misses, is that they refuse to make a plan. They just refuse point blank to have any plan. And I think that's probably our biggest problem in not just the railways, but in transport more widely, is there is no plan. The DFT are just sort of like, oh, it's not our job to, transport's not our job. I'm sure hopefully everyone agrees with me on that point in the call. Some staunch Conservative supporters on this call that I'm really upset, sorry.
This is York Green Party. So
I figured, yeah.
But yeah, I do think that transport is not the Department of Transport's job, because they really are interested in cars. So be taken away from them and made part of the Ministry of Climate Change, probably.
And I suppose that wet weather won't be a problem, hopefully. Not too much of one.
The way it goes.
As in, for HS2, you mean? Sorry, Sarah Jane.
Well, yeah, I mean, I don't know. Like, I was worried about the like the concrete. It's not porous, is it? I'm wrong. I don't know about that. I don't know when that.
So when we build, yeah, no, it's a fair question. When we build new railways, and indeed the existing railway, we build them in such a way that whatever weather they have to cope with in their design life, whether like 200 years. Actually, the design life of HS2 is 120 years, but the reality is it'll last longer than that. We design it to cope with any weather we expect over that period. As you can imagine, that's quite a lot now because climate change has already bitten quite a bit, which means our projections now are quite a lot higher than they were even 10 years ago. So in terms of rainfall, we have to design what's called a drainage system. So it's all a bit like your drainage on your house, just the same for the railway. It gets the water where it needs to go safely and in such a way that it doesn't damage the surrounding area.
So you're actually designing larger culverts and so on for the more intense
yeah.
rainfall.
Larger yeah. I mean, some of the culverts are. I mean, this is probably not the thing to say to the Green Party when they're talking about like HS2 carbon emissions. Some of the culverts on the HS2 are bonkers. They are huge. The culverts are like you can walk through them, and the reason for that, unfortunately, is that is that climate science is such, and the forecasts are such that. Even in like an average scenario, there's going to be a lot more water falling on this country in very short periods of time.
Well, we can still hope not, maybe. I don't know.
So yeah, all the infrastructure is designed to cope with a lot of extra surge rainfall, short spikes of extreme rainfall that we've been seeing more of recently.
Okay, are there any final thoughts? If not, well, thank you very much, Gareth, and that's provoked a really interesting discussion and lots of thoughts. I've certainly got to go away and rethink what I was thinking, and I'm sure we will all be doing that over the next few days and weeks. So really, really interesting. Can you pass our thanks on to Tim?
I shall do. The only thing I can add is thanks everyone. That's been really good. Hopefully a really good discussion. Hopefully some interesting stuff in there. I'm not expecting everyone to suddenly be a convert, but I suppose I just want, as people on the left, it's good for us to have evidence-based discussions, and hopefully I've helped spark some ideas and evidence sources. The only recommendation I can make is if you are Twitter users, is to go and find the users Greens for HS2. So that's Greens for with a number, HS2, who have some really good, very evidence-based threads that address a lot of these questions, particularly on things like, do we need more travel compared to modal shift? Really good threads on there that go into a lot of good detail. But thanks everyone, that's been really good. I've enjoyed that.
Thank you.